Imagine a world where the Bible is a treasure map and the treasure is the truth about God's plan for humanity. But what if the map is incomplete and some of the most important parts are missing? That's the shocking reality we face when we look at the work of one of the most influential figures in evangelical Reformed faith, Geerhardus Vos. Vos was a towering figure in the world of biblical theology. In 1894, he was installed as a professor at Princeton Seminary, and his inaugural lecture set the stage for his groundbreaking work. He defined biblical theology as the study of how God reveals himself through history. But here's the twist. Despite his brilliance, Vos's most famous book, Biblical Theology, is missing some crucial pieces of the puzzle. When Vos wrote his seminal work, he was responding to a world that was changing rapidly. Historical critical methods were challenging traditional views of the Bible, and liberalism was on the rise. Vos stood firm, defending the evangelical Reformed faith. His book became a cornerstone for many students in the 1960s, providing an early introduction to evangelical biblical theology. But as we look back, we see that his work, while influential, is not without its flaws. Vos's definition of biblical theology is clear. It's the branch of exegetical theology that deals with the process of God's self-revelation in the Bible. He emphasized the importance of this process, which unfolds over time and through specific events in history. However, when we dive into the content of his book, we find some surprising omissions. Vos starts with the principle of probation in the Garden of Eden, but he skips over the theology of creation in Genesis 1. This is a significant gap, as the story of creation is foundational to understanding the rest of the Bible. He then moves on to the covenant of works and the covenant of grace, which are central to his covenantal theology. But as he progresses through the Old Testament, he leaves out important parts of the story. For example, Vos doesn't spend much time on the history of Israel recorded in Joshua and Judges. He skips over key figures like David and Solomon and the building of the temple. Instead, he focuses on the prophetic office and the period of Moses. While these are important, the omission of other crucial events and figures leaves a hole in his narrative. The most striking omission, however, is in his treatment of the New Testament. Vos only covers the incarnation and public ministry of Jesus, leaving out the passion, death, resurrection, ascension, and the expected return of Christ. He also excludes the period of the Acts and the apostolic ministry. This means that some of the most significant events in the New Testament are missing from his biblical theology. Despite these gaps, Vos's work is still a classic. He makes important points about the progressive nature of revelation, the organic growth of God's plan, and the practical adaptability of biblical truth. But these insights are limited by the structure he chooses to follow. Vos's method is based on the principle of covenant making, which he sees as the key to understanding the epochs of Revelation. He divides history into periods marked by significant covenantal events, such as the call of Abraham, the Exodus, and the coming of Christ. While this framework is useful, it doesn't capture the full complexity of the Bible's story. Enter Edmund P. Clowney, a professor at Westminster Seminary, who built on Vos's work. Clowney emphasizes the importance of understanding the epochs of redemptive history, which he sees as marked by events like creation, the fall, the flood, the call of Abraham, the Exodus, and the coming of Christ. He argues that each epoch has its own theological horizon, and that understanding these horizons is crucial for preaching and teaching the Bible. Clowney's approach is more comprehensive than Vos's, but it still has its limitations. He doesn't always provide a clear justification for his choice of epochs, and his method can sometimes oversimplify the distinctions between different periods of biblical history. For example, the theological horizon of the latter prophets is quite different from that of the former prophets and the period of Moses. In his later work, The Unfolding Mystery, Clowney provides a more devotional approach to biblical theology. He traces the main points of the Old Testament story and makes frequent connections to the New Testament, showing how the Old Testament points to Christ. This approach is valuable, but it doesn't always provide a clear, structural analysis of the Bible's narrative. So, what does this mean for us? If we want to understand the Bible as a coherent and unified story, we need to be aware of the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches to biblical theology. Vos and Clowney have given us valuable insights, but their work also shows us that there is still much to explore and discover. The treasure map of the Bible is complex and rich, and no single approach can capture all its nuances. But by understanding the strengths and limitations of different methods, we can better navigate the journey and find the treasure we seek. Dennis E. Johnson, who learned from Clowney at Westminster Seminary, wrote a book called Him We Proclaim. This book builds on Clowney's ideas and fills in some gaps. Johnson explains the theory behind Christ-centered preaching in more detail. He looks at how the prophets in the Old Testament connect to the bigger story of Jesus. Johnson's work shows how important Clowney's ideas were and how they can be developed further. Willem van Gemeren, another important biblical theologian, wrote The Progress of Redemption in 1988. He was influenced by Vos and Clowney and shares their focus on Christ. Van Gemeren divides the history of God's people into 12 periods. Each period is distinct, but connected to the others. He focuses on the covenant as a central theme and explains how the Old Testament leads to the New Testament. Van Gemeren's approach is very detailed and helps us understand the whole story of the Bible from creation to the new creation. William J. Dummerell is an Australian scholar who has written several important works on biblical theology. His first major work was about the covenants in the Old Testament. He looks at the covenants with Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and the New Covenant. Dummerell also wrote The Faith of Israel, which explains the teachings of each book in the Old Testament. In another work, he explores the Old Testament background to Revelation 21 to 22. Dummerell's method is to trace the development of themes from the Old Testament to the New Testament, showing how they reach their full meaning in Jesus. Sidney Graydon is known for his work on preaching from the Old Testament. He wrote Sola Scriptura, which discusses how to apply Old Testament stories to modern Christians. In The Modern Preacher and the Ancient Text, Graydon explains how preaching and understanding the Bible are closely connected. His most famous work, Preaching Christ from the Old Testament, shows different ways to connect Old Testament texts to Jesus. Graydon emphasizes the continuity between the Old and New Testaments, especially how the prophets saw the future in terms of past events. Charles H. Scobie wrote, The Ways of Our God, a comprehensive biblical theology of the entire Bible. Scobie discusses different approaches to biblical theology, such as systematic, historical, and thematic. He argues that none of these approaches alone can fully capture the unity and diversity of the Bible. Instead, Scobie proposes a multi-thematic approach, focusing on 4 main themes: God's order, God's servant, God's people, and God's way. He organizes each chapter around these themes, showing how they develop from the Old Testament to the New Testament. This approach helps us see the big picture of God's plan throughout the Bible. When we talk about the Bible, many people see it as a big story with many smaller stories inside. Some think it's like a puzzle with many pieces that fit together in a special way. Others see it as a big book with lots of different parts that don't really connect. In this chapter, we'll look at how some smart people think about these ideas and what they say about understanding the Bible. As a whole, one of these people is a man named Scobie. He wrote a big book about the Bible, but some people think his way of looking at things is too broad. They say he doesn't show how the Bible's story changes and grows over time. For example, he talks about the idea that the Lord is king and jumps around in the Bible from one part to another without showing how this idea changes as the story moves forward. This makes it hard to see the big picture of how God's plan unfolds. Scobie also doesn't seem to like the idea that the Bible has one main theme or center. He thinks it's too hard to find just one theme that explains everything. But if we believe that the Bible is one big story from God, then it makes sense to ask what holds it all together. Scobie's way of organizing the Bible into categories like God's order and God's people is helpful, but some people think it misses the bigger story of God's kingdom. Another pair of thinkers, Bartholomew and Goheen, see the Bible as a big play with 6 acts. The play starts with creation and ends with a new creation. They focus on the kingdom of God as the main theme, and they use the idea of a covenant, a special promise, as a supporting theme. Their approach is good because it shows how God's story is about real events and people, not just ideas. However, some parts of the Old Testament, like the wisdom books and the prophets, don't get as much attention as they should. This can make it seem like these parts of the Bible are less important, even though they are crucial to understanding God's plan. The story of Jesus and the early church is told in detail, which is great because it helps us see where we fit into God's big story. But sometimes the book doesn't explain the deep theological ideas behind the story. For example, it doesn't talk much about how the prophets' messages relate to the time they lived in, or how their messages connect to the bigger story of God's kingdom. Another thinker, Geerhardus Vos, believes that the Bible is like a big puzzle with many pieces. He thinks it's important to look at each piece, or book, of the Bible on its own, before trying to put them all together. He doesn't like the idea of finding one main theme because he thinks it might make us ignore some parts of the Bible. But Vos also believes that there is a deeper unity in the Bible, and that unity comes from God, who is the center of both the Old and New Testaments. Vos's approach is to look at the different themes and ideas that run through the Bible and see how they connect. He thinks it's important to preserve the unique message of each book, while also showing how they all fit together. This is a good idea, but it can be tricky to do in practice. How do we make sure that we don't miss important parts of the story while trying to see the big picture? In the end, all these thinkers are trying to help us understand the Bible better. They each have different ways of looking at it, but they all agree that the Bible is a special book that tells us about God's plan for the world. Whether we focus on one main theme or look at many different pieces, the goal is to see how God's story connects to our own lives and helps us understand who we are and what we should do. Vos talks a lot about looking at different themes, motifs, and concepts in the Bible, but he doesn't really explain how to put all these themes together into one big picture. He focuses more on looking at individual books and parts of the Bible, rather than seeing how they all fit together over time. This is different from what some other scholars, like Vos and Clowney, do. They try to see the Bible as a story that unfolds in different stages, or epochs. These stages show how God's plan of salvation progresses over time. Hazel doesn't really talk about these stages, so his approach is more like looking at snapshots of the Bible rather than seeing the whole movie. Sidney Geerhardus is another scholar who has written a lot about how to preach from the Bible, especially the Old Testament. He believes that all of the Old Testament points to Jesus Christ, and he has identified several ways to connect the Old Testament to Christ. For example, he talks about how the Old Testament stories and promises find their fulfillment in Jesus, how types in the Old Testament foreshadow Christ, and how the themes in the Old Testament are developed and completed in the New Testament. Geerhardus is very careful to make sure that his approach is Christ-centered, but he doesn't fully embrace the idea of breaking the Bible into different epochs like Vos and Clowney do. He believes that God's plan of salvation is consistent, but also progresses over time. But he doesn't use specific stages or periods to explain this progression. Instead, he focuses on the overall theme of God's redemptive history, which culminates in Jesus. Elmer Martins takes a different approach. He looks at a specific passage in Exodus 5:22-6:8, and uses it to identify four main themes in the Old Testament: salvation, the covenant community, the experience and knowledge of God, and the land. Martin structures his book around these themes, showing how they developed throughout the Old Testament. He divides the Old Testament into different periods, such as the pre-monarchy period, the monarchy period, and the post-monarchy period. This shows that Martins does recognize different stages in the history of God's people, even if he doesn't call them epochs in the same way Vos and Clowney do. When we look at these different approaches, we can see that they all have something valuable to offer. Hazel helps us see the richness and diversity of themes in the Bible. Geerhardus shows us how to connect the Old Testament to Christ, and Martins helps us see how these themes develop over time. However, if we want to understand the Bible as a unified story, we might need to combine these approaches. We can appreciate the different themes and motifs, see how they point to Christ, and also recognize the stages or epochs in the story of God's salvation. One way to think about this is to see the Bible as a big puzzle. Each piece of the puzzle is important, but we need to put the pieces together to see the whole picture. The themes and motifs are like the different colors and shapes in the puzzle pieces, and the epochs are like the sections of the puzzle that show different parts of the story. By putting all these pieces together, we can see how the whole story of the Bible points to Jesus and the salvation he brings. The Old Testament is a big story that unfolds over many generations, and it's important to understand how different parts of this story connect to each other. Some parts of the story are more significant than others, and these significant parts are often called epochs or watershed events. These events mark important turning points in the relationship between God and his people. Let's look at some of these key events and see how they are understood in the rest of the Old Testament. The story of the Old Testament starts with creation. In the book of Genesis, we read about how God made the world and everything in it, including humans. This creation story is not just a one-time event. It's a foundation that the rest of the Old Testament builds on. For example, in the Psalms and the books of the prophets, we see references to God as the Creator, emphasizing his power and sovereignty. Psalm 8 talks about how amazing it is that God made humans to be so special. And Psalm 100 links God's creation with his covenant with Israel. The fall, when Adam and Eve disobey God, is another crucial event. Even though the Old Testament doesn't talk about Adam and the fall as much as you might expect, the idea of rebellion against God is a constant theme. The Old Testament often talks about Israel's disobedience and the consequences of it, like being exiled from their land. This exile is seen as a kind of new fall, where God's people are separated from the promised land, which is like a new Eden. The hope is always that God will bring his people back, just as he promised to fix the problem caused by the fall. The flood is another big event in the Old Testament. God sends a flood to punish the world for its wickedness, but he saves Noah and his family. This event shows that God is both just and merciful. He punishes sin, but he also offers grace to those he chooses. The Old Testament doesn't talk about the flood as much as it does about other events, but it's still important. In Isaiah chapter 54, verse 9, God compares his faithfulness to Israel with his covenant with Noah, promising that he will never again destroy the earth by flood. This shows that the flood is a symbol of God's commitment to his people, even when they fail. Abraham is one of the most important figures in the Old Testament. God makes a special promise to Abraham, saying that he will make him the father of a great nation and give him a land to live in. This promise is called a covenant, and it's a big deal. The story of Abraham and his descendants, Isaac and Jacob, is a central part of the Old Testament. They face many challenges, but God always keeps his promises to them. The book of Exodus, for example, tells us that God brought the Israelites out of Egypt because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This shows that the covenant with Abraham is not just a one-time event. It's a promise that God keeps throughout history. After the Israelites are in Egypt for a long time, a new king comes to power who doesn't remember Joseph. This king treats the Israelites badly and makes them slaves. God hears their cries and sends Moses to lead them out of Egypt. The story of the Exodus is one of the most important in the Old Testament. It shows how God rescues his people from slavery and sets them free. The events of the Exodus, like the plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea, become symbols of God's power and love. Moses is also important because he receives the law from God, which teaches the Israelites how to live in a way that pleases God. The Exodus and the giving of the law are seen as a new beginning for the Israelites, a fresh start in their relationship with God. Throughout the Old Testament, we see these events being remembered and reflected on. For example, in Joshua 24, Joshua reminds the Israelites of how God brought them out of Egypt and gave them the promised land. He tells them that they should choose to serve God, just as their ancestors did. In 1 Kings 18, when Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal, he calls on the God of Abraham to show his power. This shows that the covenant with Abraham is still important, even many years later. In 2 Kings 13:23, we read that God is still faithful to his promise to Abraham, even when the Israelites are being oppressed by their enemies. This shows that the covenant with Abraham is a continuing theme in the Old Testament, a reminder of God's faithfulness and love. David is another important figure in the Old Testament. He is often seen as a continuation of the covenant with Abraham. David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and sings songs of thanksgiving, reminding the people of God's deeds and his faithfulness. In 1 Chronicles 16, David's song emphasizes God's role as creator and the futility of idolatry. This shows that the themes of creation and covenant are still important in the time of David. The Old Testament is a story of God's faithfulness and love, and these key events, creation, the fall, the flood, the covenant with Abraham, and the Exodus, are central to that story. They are not just isolated events. They are part of a larger narrative that shows how God is always working to bring his people back to him. By understanding these events and how they are reflected on in the rest of the Old Testament, we can better appreciate the continuity and significance of God's plan for his people. The events at Sinai stand as a pivotal moment in the Old Testament, marking a critical shift in the story of God's people. However, It's important to understand that this event is not a complete break from the past. The promises made to Abraham are the foundation for everything that happens in the Exodus and the giving of the law at Sinai. In the book of Exodus, we see God reminding Moses and the Israelites of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When God calls Moses at the burning bush, he explicitly states that he has come to fulfill his promise to their ancestors. Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, 15 to 16. Even when the Israelites sin with the golden calf, Moses pleads with God to remember his covenant with Abraham. Exodus chapter 32, verse 13-14. The command to leave Sinai is also rooted in God's promise to give Abraham's descendants the land of Canaan. Exodus chapter 33, verse 1-3. The Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments, begins with God reminding the Israelites that He is the one who delivered them from Egypt, which was a fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. Exodus chapter 20, verse 1-2. This shows that the law is not just a set of rules, but a continuation of God's covenant with His people. In Leviticus, the connection to the Abrahamic covenant is clear. The book promises that obedience to God's laws will bring the blessings of the covenant, including a fruitful land. Leviticus chapter 26, verse 3-13. The land of Canaan, described as a land flowing with milk and honey, is a direct fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. This theme is echoed in the prophets, who often compare the promised land to the Garden of Eden. Isaiah chapter 51, verse 3, Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 35, 47, 1-12. Deuteronomy, which means second law, is a reiteration of the law given at Sinai. It emphasized the importance of the Mosaic period, but also constantly refers back to the Abrahamic covenant. The book of Deuteronomy is a bridge between the past and the future, reminding the Israelites of their history and preparing them for their entry into the promised land under Joshua. The crossing of the Jordan River is a significant event, mirroring the crossing of the Red Sea. It marks a new beginning for the Israelites as they enter the land promised to Abraham. Despite the challenges and setbacks, the narrative moves toward the establishment of the kingdom of David and Solomon, which is seen as the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. David is a central figure in the Old Testament, and his reign is often viewed as the high point of Israel's history. The books of Samuel and Kings tell the story of David's rise to power, his flaws, and his achievements. Despite his sins, David is described as a man after God's own heart. God makes a covenant with David, promising that his throne will be established forever. 2 Samuel 7, 4-16. This covenant is a continuation of the Abrahamic covenant, emphasizing that God will be a God to David and his descendants. The city of Jerusalem, or Zion, becomes the focal point of God's plans for Israel. David captures the city and brings the Ark of the Covenant there, making it the spiritual and political center of the nation. The Psalms often refer to Zion as the place where God dwells and where his people can find refuge. Solomon, David's son, builds the temple in Jerusalem, fulfilling one of the key promises made to David. The temple is a symbol of God's presence among his people and a place of worship and sacrifice. Solomon's reign is marked by great wisdom and prosperity, but it also ends in tragedy. His descent into idolatry and rebellion sets the stage for the division of the kingdom and the eventual exile of the Israelites. Throughout these events, the continuity of God's covenant with Abraham is evident. The law given at Sinai, the establishment of the kingdom under David, and the building of the temple by Solomon are all part of God's plan to fulfill his promises to Abraham. These events show that God's faithfulness and grace are at the heart of the Old Testament narrative. The temple is a central theme in biblical theology, It's the place where God meets his people. Some biblical scholars see Eden as the original sanctuary, and they are likely correct. The story progresses from Eden to the Promised Land, which the Israelites were denied in Egypt but later achieved. The land became focused on the tabernacle, and then the temple in Jerusalem, God's presence, often described as his glory, is closely tied to the temple. The glory of the Lord appeared to the Israelites after the Exodus, and Moses encountered it on Mount Sinai. The glory filled the tabernacle and was seen when God's fire consumed the burnt offering. The promise that all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord hints at a time when the whole world will again become God's sanctuary. The name Ichabod, meaning the glory has departed, was given when the Ark of the Covenant was captured, symbolizing the loss of God's presence. When Solomon brought the Ark into the new temple, the glory of the Lord filled the house. However, when the temple was destroyed in 586 BC, the prophet Ezekiel's visions showed the glory leaving the temple, moving to the east, and settling on a mountain. This suggests that the glory went with the faithful remnant in Babylon. If not, it certainly did not stay in the corrupted temple in Jerusalem. Wisdom is another important theme. The stories in 1 Kings provide the historical basis for Solomon's reputation as a wise king, and his name is linked to the book of Proverbs. However, David also played a role in the development of wisdom. David's counselors showed how wisdom became part of the kingdom's fabric. Wisdom is not unique to Israel. All cultures have their own wisdom traditions. As Derek Kidner notes, Solomon built on the wisdom that already existed in Israel. Joshua was filled with the spirit of wisdom, and the law of Sinai was central to the wisdom that guided Israel's leaders. While the law and prophetic revelation became the main sources of guidance, wisdom is as old as civilization itself. The fear of Yahweh is linked to wisdom, as seen in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 6. 2 wise women influenced David's life, and he later established the role of counselor, institutionalizing wisdom. Wisdom can go wrong when it loses its focus on the fear of Yahweh and becomes mere worldly cleverness. The prophets criticized the wise men who had strayed from God's path, warning that their wisdom would perish. The theme of exile is significant in the Bible. Israel's history is marked by periods of exile, starting with Adam and Eve's expulsion from Eden. Abraham lived as an alien in the Promised Land, and his descendants went to Egypt for food, leading to captivity. The wilderness wanderings, threats to Israel's possession of Canaan, and the exiles to Assyria and Babylon all reflect this theme. Even after the return from exile, the expectations of renewal were not fully met. N.T. Wright notes that the promise of God's glory returning was still future in Second Temple literature. The New Testament picks up this theme, seeing the new exodus and redemption in Christ as the resolution to the tension of exile. The books of Kings describe Israel's decline, especially under Rehoboam, Solomon's son. The division of the kingdom into 2 rival nations and the false cultic practices in the north led to spiritual decline. Despite the efforts of prophets like Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea, the northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BC. In the south, the reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah were insufficient to prevent the Babylonian destruction in 586 BC. The prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel condemned Israel's apostasy, leading to the exile. Jeremiah advised the people to surrender to the Babylonians, while Ezekiel's visions showed pagan rituals in the temple and the departure of God's glory. Despite the national disaster, there were faithful believers who trusted God's promises and expressed grief and repentance. Jeremiah's laments and the Book of Lamentations reflect the grief of the exile, but also hold on to hope in God's faithfulness. Psalms, like Psalm 137, express the pain of exile, while others, like Psalm 44 and Psalm 74, plead with God to remember His covenant and restore His people. The latter prophets provide a detailed account of the events leading to the exile and offer hope for the future. They indict Israel for breaking the covenant, pronounce God's judgment, and assure the faithfulness of a remnant. The prophetic eschatology focuses on the return from exile and the restoration of the nation. The prophets use the past events of salvation history as a pattern for the future. The restoration is seen as a new beginning, a recapitulation of key, redemptive moments, but with greater permanence and glory. The return from exile under Cyrus and the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the Temple were partial fulfillments of prophetic hope, but they fell short of the glory of Solomon's kingdom. The post-exilic prophets encouraged hope for the ultimate coming of the kingdom. The prophets saw the decline of the nation as a result of covenant breaking and unfaithfulness. The kingdom of David and Solomon stood as the high point in Israel's history, representing the fulfillment of the promises to Abraham. Despite the reforms and the efforts of prophets, the decline could not be stopped. The return from exile was a partial fulfillment of hope, but it did not match the glory of the Solomonic kingdom. The post-exilic prophets highlighted the ongoing problems and encouraged hope for the future kingdom. The latter prophets used the great moments of salvation history as a pattern for the future. Biblical history begins with creation and the call of Abraham, followed by the Exodus, the giving of the law at Sinai, the possession of the promised land, and the establishment of the kingdom and the temple. The prophetic eschatology looks forward to a future stage that recapitulates these events, but with greater permanence and glory. The prophets saw both the immediate return from exile and the ultimate day of the Lord when God would act definitively to bring about His kingdom. The post-exilic prophets emphasized the distinction between the partial and perfect fulfillments, showing that the kingdom was yet to come. As we close this journey through the Old Testament, we see a rich tapestry woven with threads of creation, covenant, and hope. From the very beginning, when God formed the world and called it good, to the promises made to Abraham, Moses, and David, we find a story that points to a future of restoration and new beginnings. The prophets, with their powerful messages, remind us of the deep connection between God's creation and His people. When Israel strayed from God's path, the prophets spoke of judgment, but they also held out a vision of a new creation, a world where the harmony of nature and the peace of God's people would be restored. This new creation is not just a return to the past, but a transformation that brings forth a world more beautiful and just than ever before. In the stories of the patriarchs, we see God's faithfulness to His promises. Abraham, chosen by God, becomes the father of a great nation, and his descendants are reminded that God will always be with them, guiding and protecting them. The Exodus from Egypt, led by Moses, becomes a symbol of God's power to deliver His people from oppression. But it's not just a story of the past. It's a promise of future deliverance, a new Exodus that will bring about a deeper and more lasting freedom. The covenant with David adds another layer to this story. David, the shepherd king, is promised an eternal dynasty, a line of rulers who will bring justice and peace. The prophets speak of a future king, a descendant of David, who will reign with wisdom and righteousness. This king is not just a political leader, but a symbol of God's presence and rule over His people. Jerusalem, the city of David, becomes a central symbol in this story, known as Zion. It is the place where God's presence is most deeply felt. The prophets envisioned a day when Zion will be transformed, a place of joy and celebration where God's glory will shine brightly. This transformed Zion is a picture of what God intends for all of creation, a world where God and His people dwell together in perfect harmony. The prophets also remind us that this new creation is not just about a future event. It's a process that begins in the hearts of God's people. When God's Spirit is poured out, the wilderness becomes a fruitful field, and the desert blooms with life. This transformation is a sign of God's power to renew and restore not just the land, but the very fabric of creation. As we look to the future, we are invited to join in this story of hope. The promises of God, made to Abraham, Moses, and David, are not just for the past. They are for us today. We are part of a larger narrative, a story of redemption and restoration that reaches from the beginning of time to the end of the ages. In this story, we find a God who is always faithful, always working to bring about His purposes, and always calling us to trust in His promises. So, as we close this chapter, let us hold on to the hope that God has given us. Let us look forward to the day when the new creation will be fully realized, when God will dwell with His people, and when the world will be made new. This is the promise of the Old Testament, a promise that points us to the ultimate fulfillment in the coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ.